If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. What is the creepiest thing you have ever seen, or experienced? When I was 9, my extended family and I went camping on the shore of Lake Michigan. About a mile down the beach from us was an abandoned religious summer camp. It consisted of a chapel, a main lodge house with a rec room and 2 wings of dormitories, as well as several outbuildings. It represented a great opportunity for exploring and lockjaw. One day my cousins, my brother and I found a ventriloquist dummy. Time had lent it meant a howdy-doody-like aspect. This freaked us out, so we left and continued along the beach blowing up frogs and dead fish as children often do around the 4th of July. We made the mistake of telling our father and uncles about the discovery. That night our dad did 2 things. First, he told us a spooky story about the evil ventriloquist dummy and its horrible need for revenge. Then, he and my uncles went to the abandoned summer camp, found the dummy, decapitated it, and placed the head so that upon entering the main buildings of the camp it would be staring directly at you. The next day we returned to the abandoned summer camp, opened the door, screamed, peed a little, and then ran the fastest mile you've ever seen a chubby 9-year-old run. Sometimes I still see it in my dreams. I grew up in a rural Ohio town, where there was never anything to do. So one night, my friends and I decided to drive around and hit all the scary places, all the spots of local lore. We went to the purportedly haunted cemetery, the supposedly haunted house, the local cry-baby bridge, and finally, an abandoned church in the middle of the country that was rumored to have been taken over by Satan worshippers. Each of these stops are creepy, and we're also doing our best to creep ourselves out. But when we return to the car after leaving the church, that's when it gets crazy weird. We're at a crossroads right by the church in the middle of nowhere. It's August, the corn is high, it's probably 3 a.m., when all of a sudden a big pickup truck drives up to the intersection on the road right next to us. The 2 vehicles, ours and the truck, just sit there for a minute. We're waiting for the other guy to move on, probably a little confused because we don't expect to find anyone else at this hour at this location. When the truck refuses to move, we finally start on our way back to town. The truck then turns and begins to follow us, tailing us. We go faster and faster and faster, all the while the truck is right on the tail of the car. He'll speed up and start to drive in the lane right next to us, then he'll drop back and start tailing us again. And the creepiest element of all, he's continually honking his horn. It's a novelty horn that plays the first 12 notes of the Song of Dixie. So basically we're being chased in the middle of nowhere by some sadistic redneck. I figure his next move is to run us off the road and then do who knows what to us in the middle of some cornfield. This goes on for about 5 or 10 minutes, seemed like an eternity, when, thankfully, we reach the edge of town and the truck drops back and turns. The next Monday I'm at school in study hall when I hear a horn honk outside is the same damn 12 notes of the Song of Dixie. I froze in my chair. When I was an undergrad, I worked at an independent coffee house to pay the bills. It was a great job, 4 p.m. to 11 p.m. with no supervision and plenty of tips if I could muster sufficient charm for the repeat customers. As you can imagine, my friends would routinely use the place as a hangout since not only was the coffee free, but the neighborhood was generally fun. The only downside was that I had to clean and close the place myself. This took about an hour, and it could get somewhat creepy since the cafe was mostly underground, and the rest of the local businesses, save for a pizza shop around the corner, closed around 9. But most of the time somebody would hang around to help me close. Vacuuming alone was the worst. I always hated that one of my senses was effectively turned off while my back was to the door to the street, a glass affair that sat at the bottom of a concrete staircase. I would always imagine that I'd look up and, bam, somebody would be standing there ready to take the easy money from the cafe, with me in his way. Never happened. The worst part was that bank of switches that controlled the lights was in the back by the counter. After throwing the cafe into total darkness, I had to walk the length of the building towards door, and standing on a small landing, I would unlock the door to let myself out. The corner of the landing was the darkest part of the cafe, absolutely no illumination from streetlight through tiny windows, nothing. Just inky blackness and total silence. It was awful standing there for even the few seconds it took to unlock the door if I really got the old imagination going. One night I'm fumbling with the keys, and I hear a barely audible but absolutely clear whisper from the corner, "So where you going now?" After screaming like mad and practically kicking the door down, I managed to get outside to the staircase leading up to the street. It took everything in me to turn around, face the glass door, and relock it before getting out of there. I always get that this is too creepy when I tell it. The first happened when I was a younger kid, maybe 10 or 11. My cousins and I were staying, with our parents, at our family's campgrounds, way out in the Appalachians in WV, We were always going off and exploring the woods and all the nature and everything, and we knew that down the road from the camp, it's not like a tent-style camping area, but we have cabins and an uncle who built a big house for everyone to stay in. There was a path that led up to a big field. So we all decide we're gonna walk down one day and take that path up to the field and just go play around. When we get to the field, we're kind of surprised to see it's maintained and the grass is mowed, or at least it's not tall, and we're playing out there and we see off in the distance that there's something out there with a black wrought iron fence around it. And it turns out to be this incredibly old cemetery. Now, what immediately registers as creepy is the fact that there is no way to get to that cemetery except by foot. It's surrounded by acres and acres of field. The gate to the fence is locked, and so we climb it and go in, and we're checking the tombstones out, and they're all from like the 30s and back, old. We notice a lot of them have little mementos and stuff left there, and my cousin sees this big shiny stone on one of them, and he pockets it, and eventually we end up back home. So, where it gets creepy, that night we all wake up to a loud banging at the front door. It sounds like someone is straight up trying to kick the door down, and we're all freaking out. We're in the cabin for the kids, by ourselves, and all of our parents are surely asleep. I'm paralyzed on one sofa, begging my cousin to look out the window, when suddenly the banging stops. We all crowd together on my couch, and no one moves until the sun comes up. So my cousins and I figure maybe it's the stone he took, and we need to put it back. There's just a little problem. We can't find it. Eventually we assume he lost it somewhere or something. I don't remember the exact details, and it's not until we make our way back out to that cemetery a few days later with some cousins that just arrived, that we find the damn stone, right back where he took it from, sitting on top of that tombstone. We ran for our lives. I was in Dublin for my sister's wedding a few years ago. My family and I were staying in the Jury's Inn, and I was sharing a double room with my brother. Anyway, the night before the wedding we all turned in pretty early. I'd like to stress at this point that at the time I had no alcohol or any other drugs/stimulants in me. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, sometime around 3:30 or so, as I'm prone to do from time to time. Looked around the room and closed my eyes again. Then my brain processes what I just saw. There was a man sitting on the chair by the window, leaning forward and staring at me. Instantly I was awake. I began to get out of the bed and looked back at the chair. It was a kid, no more than 15/16, wearing one of those silly bellboy uniforms. That pretty much threw me even more off balance. I managed to say, "Hey, what are you doing here?" He looked at the ceiling, looked back at me, then slowly leaned back on the chair and faded away. All in all, I was fully awake looking at this kid for 10/12 of a second. I never told anyone because I don't believe in ghosts. Did freak me out though. When I was in high school, me and a buddy decided to go out to the insane asylum to drink some beers. It was this old abandoned place out in the middle of the desert. It might have actually been an old boys' camp or something. Well, we drive out there and I get this weird scary feeling like something bad is going to happen. So I tell my buddy that I'm gonna drive around the circle. It was buildings that were built around a circular driveway/road, to make sure no one weird was out there. Well, we drive around and it looks empty. It's in the middle of the desert, at least 5 miles from the nearest house. We get out and I crack a beer. My buddy cracks a beer. All of a sudden I hear what sounds like a little kid laughing, but it sounds like it's coming from all around even though it's just one voice. I ask him if he heard that, and then we both hear a whole group of childlike voices laughing, and you can't tell where it's coming from. I threw my beer and jumped in the car and took off. Never went back there. This happened like 4 years before Blair Witch Project came out, and when I saw that scene when they were in the tent and you hear the kids outside of it, I got really creeped out. I still get hair standing up on my neck when I tell this story. I was spending the night at my friend Rich's house with 2 other friends. I was 14 to 15 at the time. We were all sleeping out on his second floor porch. At some point during the night, I awoke to a strange blue light that looked like an LED or something, and it was shining directly in the window, nearly lighting up the whole room. I remember being absolutely terrified and confused. I slowly turned my head to see if I could get a glimpse of the source of the light. As I turned over, the light began moving around the side of the porch until it reached the far side. Then it faded away. After a substantial amount of time, never moving mind you in fear due to being terrified, I finally fell back asleep. Upon waking, I told the story to my other friends. I was certain that they'd think I was crazy, but they had seen the light too. All 3 of them were too terrified to move at the time. We had identical stories. They finished my sentences as I described what had gone on and what I had seen. Please keep in mind that this porch was a good 25 to 30 feet off the ground, making it nearly impossible for a person to have been shining a light into the window. Very creepy shit. We've grown apart and I don't see them often, but every once in a while if we're out having a beer someone will bring it up. It still gives me chills thinking about it. My wife's friend was cleaning her house and noticed that a knife was missing while cleaning her kitchen. The knife was in one of those wooden blocks up on the counter. She continued cleaning the kitchen and didn't find the knife. She went into her son's room and asked him if he had seen the knife. Her son said Sam took it. And he hid it. Sam was the boy's imaginary friend. The creepy thing is that the boy was very small and couldn't yet reach or get up onto the counter. My wife's friend got very angry, accusing the boy of lying, but the boy just kept saying Sam took it. She tore the house apart looking for the knife and to this day has never found it. There was an abandoned amusement park near my high school and we would sometimes sneak in to drink and or smoke in some of the buildings. The best one was the haunted house because you could really go inside of it and not have to worry about security guards chasing you out of the park. From the outside the haunted house looked pretty small, about the size of a small 2-story house. I went a few times with them during the day, and I'd never gone far into the haunted house. Once you get about 20 feet in it becomes pitch black and I'd never had any light source besides a cell phone. There were lots of rumors about crackheads etc. squatting in there, but I'd never actually heard of anyone running into any. One night we went and we brought a couple of flashlights. We decided that we were going to go all the way through the haunted house. There were 6 or 7 of us, and we started climbing up the tracks into the tunnel. The 2 tracks, entrance and exit, sort of intersected, and as all my friends went up one ramp, halfway up I jumped to the other and headed in the opposite direction. To this day I have no idea why the fuck I did it, I just wanted a little extra thrill. Before they could convince me otherwise, I was running up the track and through the doors on the 2nd floor of this haunted house. Down the track sloped and down I went. I had seriously miscalculated the enormousness of this thing. It seems that nearly the entire thing was underground. Every wall had paintings of zombies, vampires, creepy faces, graffiti and fake blood splatter. After a minute or two of walking pretty quickly I started to regret going alone. While I could talk myself down from the sheer creepiness of the situation, I started to think in rational terms. This place had been abandoned for over a decade and was built to carry carts on tracks through it. It was not made to have people walking around in it. Crackheads probably didn't hang out down here, but you know what if? If this thing was as big as I was starting to think, my friends wouldn't be able to hear me if I got into any trouble. I was utterly alone. Floorboards creaked, water dripped and echoed all around. I was walking at a good pace. I kept the light shining in front of me, because I knew if I looked around and inspected every room, it wouldn't make me feel any safer, it'd just creep me out even more. After another 5 minutes or so I realized I was no longer going down. Maybe I was getting close to the middle where I'd surely meet my friends. They'd call me a crazy bastard and I'd play it off. Maybe I'd nudge Andy who had the other flashlight and we'd both turn them off at the same time, hoping to freak out the other guys for just a second. Then someone laughed. It wasn't a kid. It wasn't a friend. The voice sounded aged as if through years of alcohol and cigarette smoke. Like the moan of a woman, the sound didn't need to be louder than a pin drop, but my ears perked up and I immediately knew what it was. I swung around, aiming my flashlight around the room. The steel bars of fake jail cells and the broken bottles littering the floor shimmered in the light. I kept walking forward. The next few minutes felt like an eternity, and I stifled the urge to keep turning around and checking behind me, but I listened. After another set of rooms I came to a room with no exit. I thought maybe I'd hit a dead end, and for a second I contemplated walking back towards the laugh which had been ringing in my head over and over. But I noticed a plywood door on the far side of the room. I pulled the door open and entered a long hallway. At the other end was another plywood door. Halfway down the hall the first door slammed behind me. That's how it's supposed to work, I told myself. That's how it's supposed to work. You crash through. The doors slam. Nobody shut the door. Nobody shut that door. Nobody. Shut that door. My heart was pumping ice water and my legs were numb as they ran down the hall. As my hand touched the opposite door I prayed for the first and last time in years. The door opened easily when I pushed it and the relief was almost orgasmic. As I stepped out of the hallway I could see a light up ahead and I heard Matt's voice. I turned off my light and hid. Jumped out and scared the shit out of the rest of the guys when they rounded the corner. They called me a crazy bastard. I played it off and I asked if they'd heard any laughing. They hadn't. On the way back, returning the way I had come, we noticed in the corner of one of the larger rooms a mattress with a bunch of candles around it. The wax was warm. I was on driving around one night and experienced what is easily the creepiest thing I've ever seen. It starts off with a bit of a cliche, but hear me out. I saw 2 eyes glowing from the side of the road, and, assuming it was a deer walking into my path, immediately slammed on the brakes. I stopped with plenty of room to spare. Turns out it was a dog crossing the street. So there was a dog crossing the street and I almost hit it, but didn't. What makes that so bad? The dog was downright shit your pants creepy. It was clearly a big dog, but it looked completely emaciated. Looked like it hadn't eaten anything in weeks. It walked across the road with a completely hollow determination, like it was walking because it knew it had to, but didn't really understand why. The car nearly crushing it had no effect on its demeanor at all, and the only acknowledgement I received from him was a slow turn of his head. He rolled his head to look up at me, not even slowing his pace, and turned back away. The image of that dog really stuck with me for a while. I spent a few weeks wondering if I would see it again, but I never did. I didn't hear anything about any missing dogs. My best guess was that the dog was dying and knew it, and that knowledge had made everything completely irrelevant to it. It was such a perfect personification of that idea. I wonder how long I'll associate death with that dog. It's probably been at least a year now, and the image hasn't faded at all, so maybe it'll be a while. In 2004, I lived in Tempe, Arizona, and I received a call at 1 a.m. in the morning. It was an operator alerting me that an emergency caller had been trying to reach me all day and that I was now being transferred to the emergency caller. I was transferred to a girl named Kate, who informed me that Arizona Biological Services needs to speak to me, but the main offices are closed at that hour and that she'd transfer me to a Tucson office and they'll be able to take care of my call. So, I'm transferred. The person who answered the phone in Tucson, another girl, named Stephanie, lets me know that a girl I had dated 5 years ago in high school had a child, named me as the father, and that the kid was ready to be adopted and they needed my signature/DNA sample in order to get the child adopted. I asked for the name of the girl, and they eerily named a girl I had dated exactly 5 years from that current date, Katrina, real name. Stephanie knew where I had moved from, what I looked like. She told me my kid looked like me when I denied the kid was mine, and the mother's name. The conversation with Stephanie stopped when she put me on hold and I eventually hung up. I only dated 2 girls in high school. Never had sex with Katrina. The next day I called Katrina, who had no clue what I was talking about, no surprise, and then called Arizona Child Services, who told me 17 other men from the area had called with the same exact story, and the people on the other line all knew the names of girls they previously had dated, their physical stats, where they had moved from. The number to the fake biological center, that Stephanie they gave me, in case we were disconnected, was a Dallas radio station. A top 40 station with no DJs doing pranks or anything, just music. I called someone there who confirmed no pranks were being done. I used some online dating services to meet people. I went on dates with a couple really cool guys, and a couple major social rejects. I even found the love of my life doing so. But anyway, I had talked to this one guy named John twice online, really funny and really good looking, and I was looking forward to chatting with him again and arranging plans to meet up for coffee or a walk in the park or whatever. Anyway, I happened to not get online at all one day, because of work, meeting with friends, having a life, etc., and I hop on the next day to this guy, whom I have barely spoken to, freaking out on me about how I didn't tell him where I was going and how he can't trust me, blah blah crazy blah. So I was like, man, gotta GTFO that, peace. Stopped talking to him, he left me alone. Cool. Flash forward 5 months, my friend who, at the time, was going to UMBC was telling me about this girl who had been bludgeoned to death, raped and cut up, and left on I-95, dead, the night before. I'm like, whoa dude, effed up. I end up seeing a link to the story on someone's MySpace, this was in late 2005, and go to it, and it's John, the guy I had been chatting with only a few months ago. Talk about absolutely every hair possible standing up on my body. Makes me think of 2 events. The first one involved an instance of sleep paralysis when I was 12. I didn't know about that phenomenon then, and I was deeply afraid of the possibility of ghosts or unseen presences, so I thought there was an entity like the devil holding me down, wanting to hurt and kill me. It lasted a few minutes, which was an eternity. I hope I don't experience fear on that level anytime soon. Or ever again. The second wasn't as scary but 10x creepier. It was the second or third day of a silent Zen retreat. I was among 40 or so people doing zazen with our backs to the room, facing the wall, in complete silence of course. I heard one of the students get up and then kind of shuffle around in the middle of the room, which was very strange, but I didn't turn around. Then it sounded like they might be silently crying. All of a sudden, there was this shocking loud wail and she cried, "Oh daddy, why are you doing this to me?" She'd gone off her meds for the retreat and she was reliving horrible childhood memories. I can't speak for others in the room, but for that moment, I was there too. It was extremely disturbing and I'll never forget it. I guess that's not very Halloweeny, but it sure was creepy. When my son was 3 months old, my wife and I would take him for a drive if he was having difficulty sleeping. The movement of the truck would put him right to sleep. Well, one night we took him out. The drives were usually 20 minutes, 5 minutes until he fell asleep, and 15 to get him to deep sleep. We had a little route we always used because we liked the scenery. So one night we leave the house at 9:32 p.m. Digital clocks on microwaves make this stuff easy. We're 18 minutes into the drive coming down Creek Road, only half mile to go before we turn onto our street and then another half mile to our house. One moment I'm driving and the next moment it seems like I'm being awakened by the light coming from my truck's headlights. The truck is moving but at less than 10 miles per hour. On the road in front of us, about 40 yards, is a group of about 15 animals, groundhogs, skunks, foxes, opossums, deer, who are at that moment startled by the headlights. They pause for a second and then scatter into the forest on either side of the road. I looked at my wife and asked her what she thought, and she said that she felt like she just woke up at that moment. I looked at the clock in the truck and it was 1:12 a.m. We have no idea what happened. There were no intoxicants involved. As a matter of fact, I gave up my recreational habits years before, and my wife always was a teetotaler. The animals is what creeped us out the most. It felt like they were doing something and we were interrupting whatever they were doing. But how we lost 2.5 hours in the blink of an eye while driving to arrive at that spot at that time. I was napping upstairs inside my mother's new house on a man-made lake in the middle of a sunny afternoon when I was startled awake by a ghostly figure of a man standing next to me on the right side of the bed. He was wearing a long dark cloak that covered everything but his face and hands. He was holding an open book low before him and his head was tilted down as though looking either at the book or at me. He vanished as soon as I screamed. He was definitely from another time. That summer, the lake went far lower than usual and I found pieces of an old train track and train parts scattered where the water had receded directly in front of my mother's house. I went to a library in a nearby town and learned that a building connected to the track had once stood where the edge of the lake now normally was, and that about 200 yards to the north there was a small cemetery from the very late 1700s to 1800s that had been moved when the land began to be flooded in the 1950s. Not far from that is an Indian grave site known by the state. I was able to locate traces of the building's foundation. The area was settled mostly by the French and English with an early Spanish influence from a mission established in the late 1700s about 90 miles away. I tend to think he was somehow connected with the mission because of his clothes. He's been seen so often throughout the years by others, never again by me, visiting my mother, that I stopped keeping a record of the sightings. And now he's not always a man, but a woman in a white veil and a long white dress holding flowers or a book in her hands. The two common traits are always the covered head and something in its hands. Always. This one goes back to when I worked in a funeral home. I wrote an IAMA from a while back. I used to pick up bodies. If your loved one is elderly, with failing health, doctors will deem the death natural causes. No reason to get the coroner involved, or have an autopsy done. My partner and I went into the house, with our gurney, ready to extract the body. We got out our white sheet, and were wrapping up the body, and I had to lean over the body to wrap it up completely. As I did so, I had put pressure on her chest, while my ear was next to her head. I felt her last breath pressed from her lungs. Later in my life, I worked in a totally unrelated field, team management. I used to work in the oldest cement structure in the United States. This building had seen its share of good and bad. It was widely known that murders, suicides, and killings have been committed over the years. I was working in my office with my partner. We're on the second floor, because back in the day the water was known to flood the first floor, and I heard a knock on the front door. It's locked to the outside, so random people don't come wandering in. My partner and I turned around. I saw a woman in a pink top, with blonde hair starting to walk around the terrace to the back of the building. There are only 2 stairways off the terrace. I told my partner to watch the back exit, and I had gone to the front door. As I arrived at the front door, I caught the scent of perfume. I looked everywhere, and walked around and met my partner in the middle. Unless she had jumped off the terrace, I have no explanation of what happened to her. In a high school independent studies class we did a session on unexplained phenomena. This was in 1984, when this stuff was heavily in vogue. One guy came in to talk about how most unexplained phenomena were the result of lack of sleep or waking dreams. Ghosts are usually seen at night, or altered photographs, etc., kind of like a minor Amazing Randy. But he did make a comment that many folks have things that can't be explained away. It was likely either false memory, or simply things we don't understand yet. Then he showed us He had a photo he'd taken when he was younger, mid-70s, I think. It was just a photo of someone in an office. Then he pointed out a painting on one side wall. The contents of the painting were flowing out of the frame up the wall. He had other pictures he'd gone back and taken. The painting was a normal piece of office art. That was pre-Photoshop. Photo manipulation was not trivial, but not impossible. He seemed sincerely awed by it. Maybe he was pulling our legs, maybe it was his little trick to leave a little awe and mystery in the universe. But that photo looked creepy as hell, and I still vividly remember what it looked like. When my friend was a kid, his parents were trying to wean him off getting out of his bed and going to sleep with them, and he had been having bad dreams and seeing things that weren't there because he wasn't quite used to being alone yet, I guess. One night he looked out his window and saw the face of an old man that was wet, dirty, and covered in blood just staring in at him and not blinking. So he ran into his parents' room to tell them, and they were obviously dismissive and didn't believe him because he had been doing a lot of this stuff lately. He went back to his room and tries to ignore it, almost convinced it isn't real, but he can't handle it, so he goes back to his parents, which gets them to go check it out. Well, it turns out the guy was real. He was an Alzheimer's sufferer who had wandered away of a nursing home, had fallen into a ditch or puddle causing him to be so wet and dirty, injured his face causing it to be bruised and bloodied, and for some reason made it to their house and was content to just stare in the window. He says he can still perfectly see the face in his mind, just extremely old, wrinkled, dirty, bloody, and vacant. About 14 years ago I was in Ireland doing the college dropout backpacker thing. I wound up happening upon a hostel just north of Killarney. That happened to be an old castle. At the time I was a strict atheist and 100% stone sober. Anyhow, I was there with two fellows from Philadelphia whom I had met in Dublin, and there wasn't much to do as the castle was rather removed from town, so we went to bed quite early. Perhaps 8 or so. The first 30 minutes or so were restless, but at some point a vision of a girl entered my consciousness. I wasn't dreaming. I could only assert this in the most severe terms. I was 1000% fully awake, and yet, with my eyes closed, I saw the distinct, if somewhat phantasmal, image of a girl staring at me. Fully animated, or at least as animated as a staring girl ought to be. Blinking, sometimes, the head shifting ever so slightly, but mostly just being stared at. This was strange, of course, but I figured that it was just a trick of my mind, so I just tried to tinker with it. This psychological phenomenon. After a spell of consciously trying to move her, make her do something, to no avail, I decided that I just wanted her to go away. Of course, it wouldn't. The more I wanted this image to go away, the more it wouldn't. So I began to get concerned. Without much thought, I opened my eyes. Into my vision poured a kaleidoscopic whirlwind of carnage. My entire field of vision was taken up with discarded arms, legs, heads, and any manner of impossible destruction. Eyeless sockets, bloated tongues profanely spilling out of rotten cavities. And this whole mass of carnage was simply swirling about me in perfect three-dimensional clarity. I closed my eyes and once again saw the girl. Staring at me. Emotionless, but somehow vastly more sinister. By this point, I am absolutely petrified, in the truest sense of the word. My left leg was so tense that I got a Charlie horse. But I was too frightened to move to help work it out. All with this vision of the girl staring at me, and obviously completely incapable of opening my eyes to the horror outside. This went on for roughly 12 hours. Cramping, motionless, cold, the staring girl completely omnipresent in my reality, unable to open my eyes, unable to move, completely unable to do anything but sit completely still and to hope for it to end. At some point, my consciousness registered daylight. I steeled myself and opened my eyes and flew out of bed simultaneously. My two traveling partners were sitting on their respective cots, just staring dejectedly at the floor. I looked at them, they looked at me, and we just shook our heads. The hostel owner, upon seeing us as we prepared to leave, said, "You boys look like shite. Did the girl keep you up?" And he just sorta giggled. We took a bus into town, and I made a beeline back to Dublin. I spent the rest of the day just sitting in public places, enjoying being around people. Long post alert. Okay, I won't get into the discussion about whether or not ghosts exist. Just wanted to share a story with you that occurred in my life, just one place and one night only. Now, I am a numbers guy. I deal with them for a living, so the numbers add up or they do not. Black or white, as simple as that. I would like to think that most people who know me would refer to me as a down-to-earth guy, probably skeptical by nature. I believe in science and facts. But a very good friend of mine is about the most trustworthy, grounded individual I have ever met in life. Extremely practical and definitely with an above average level of intelligence. He had moved into a new apartment and we met for drinks shortly thereafter. At some point in our conversation he calmly states that he believes his new basement pad may be haunted. Of course I state WTF? He begins to tell me about the shenanigans going on in the bachelor suite. Seems this one battery-powered clock likes to have the hands move backwards rapidly, before always returning to the correct time. Even when the battery has been removed. Also seems that someone/thing likes to line his shoes up, one pair on top of another, slippers on top of dress shoes on top of runners, and so forth. Now all of this occurs while he, and only him, is in the basement apartment. He said the shoe thing happens about twice a day, usually while he leaves the area for less than 2 minutes, he brings his shoes into the apartment right next to the living room. The apartment is always locked and the only way in is through his one and only door. No windows that any regular-sized kid could even fit through, basement remember. So of course I think he is shitting me, but he calmly states that it had been going on every day then for about 3 weeks. He tells this occurrences are so frequent that he has even given it a name, Gertie. He said the name just felt right. Continued on to say that he wasn't afraid or worried in the least and felt he was in no danger as Gertie was probably just bored and yanking his chain.
Bigger balls than I can assure you of that.
So a few weeks go by and we are at his new pad one evening to watch the hockey game. We had only been there for about 5 minutes and stone cold sober. I had pretty much forgotten about what he had told me previously until I saw a small clock on the side table. So I asked him if this was the clock and he said yes. I then asked him to remind me about the happenings with the shoes and he asked me to hang on a minute, as he suddenly wasn't feeling well. He ran to the washroom, barely made it there and began to barf violently. It was so bad I went in to see if he was okay. I had to physically lead this massive man to his bed, where he passed out absolutely immediately. Remember, we were on our first beer and absolutely nothing else. I checked his breathing and forehead temperature and he just seemed to be in a very deep sleep. Wow, okay. So what now? I remember considering calling an ambulance or taking him to the hospital, but he truly seemed fine now and was sleeping very solidly. I chalked it up to bad food, but we had both eaten the same thing earlier, and decided that it would be best to hang around to make sure he was okay. I had kinda planned to stay there for the night anyhow, as my family was out of town for the weekend. So was the landlord who lived upstairs by himself. So I watched the remainder of the hockey game, check on my butt a few times, he was still out of it, and sipped on a couple of beers. I have to admit that what had occurred freaked me out a little and I did eye the clock once or twice but saw nothing besides a perfectly functioning clock. I guess I fell asleep watching TV but I awoke suddenly to a ear-splitting banging. I flew off the couch and immediately went to check on my friend. He was in a deeper sleep than ever, but the banging was coming towards the washroom area. It was an earth-shattering, violent, rapid banging that was so loud I figured it would surely get the attention of the folks in the next house. I moved towards the washroom but was stopped by the sight of the furnace, which was in the walkway to the washroom. It was absolutely glowing hot, fireball red, the red that only something extremely intense can produce, and the banging was coming from it. This wasn't just the furnace doesn't sound right sound. I don't think I have the vocabulary to properly explain how incredibly red and loud it was there at that moment. I thought for sure the entire house was going to explode any second. I immediately ran back to my friend's bedroom and began screaming at him to get the fuck up and began shaking him with a great amount of cruelty. We had to get out of there now. It probably took a minute or so until he finally partially awoke. I was screaming at the top of my lungs and banging him so hard his first words of course were WTF. As soon as he spoke the banging stopped immediately. I tried explaining to him what had happened and took him to the furnace, but of course it looked like it always looked and was perfectly quiet, except for its normal operating sounds. I asked him if he was okay and he said he felt great now and asked me what happened to him earlier. I explained quickly, made sure he was okay and went the hell home. He was invited to come with me but insisted on staying. I left in a hurry. We did discuss what had occurred several weeks later. He told me he felt Gertie got jealous that I was there, or upset that he had told me the crazy stories. He lived for another 2 or 3 years in that apartment but I only went there rarely and certainly never attempted to spend another night. I fully expect you to rip this apart, and you are certainly welcome to, but at least in this instance, consider this non-believer beyond spooked. I'm a light sleeper, and the slightest noise or change in air temperature can wake me up. When I still lived there, I worked as a web developer, with my computer and equipment in my room. Anyway, one night, I really needed to get up early to work on a project. I set the alarm on my computer to wake me up at 3 a.m. with music over the speakers. I faced my desk, so it was easy to see the blinking lights on everything. The first incident went like this: at 2:58, I wake up. I rarely beat the clock this early. What woke me up was the sound of keystrokes on my computer. About 4 or 5 rather loud clicks. I opened my eyes and looked down to see a black shadow blocking out the lights from my equipment, move from right to left towards the door, and then just dissolve away. Funny things is, I wasn't scared, just very angry. I am not a horror fan, I don't enjoy slasher movies, and other scary stuff. I don't really like ghost stories, and just the thought of seeing a ghost give me goosebumps. This thing just annoyed me, but I was never frightened of it. Don't really know why. I did the usual. I asked if my parents or grandparents had been in my room the night before. No one else had been there but me and my shadow. A few months after that, this happened. I took Mom's car out to buy gas for her. She goes to work at 4 a.m. and doesn't like to buy gas then. I left home at about 9:30 p.m. for the gas station, only about a mile away. I started to pump the gas, and left it going using the lock while I went to check the tires on the other side of the car. I didn't get that far, my neck hair stood up, and I glanced back at the pump handle. While I was watching, the handle returned to the off position. It didn't do to vapor capture pop and stay up, the handle was actually in the off position, still sitting in the gas intake. I felt weird, but I finished pumping, and stood back while it kept going, watching to see it again, but it didn't. I paid for the gas, and started to pull out of the station. There was a large Suburban that was heading out in front of me. It turned into traffic, and I was about to follow it when I heard a voice directly behind me say, "Hey, now." But slightly muffled. I was just about to move when it did, and I stopped, thinking there was someone in the back seat. I broke out in the cold sweats right then. I looked back, but there was no one there in the car with me. I looked around the car to see if someone was there, but being nearly 10 p.m., there was no one around the car. At the gas station, there was still a woman at the station pumping gas, and the attendant was in his booth. The attendant was a young black guy, but the voice I heard was from an older white man. It sounded like a mild Texas drawl. I looked around the car for a few seconds, but there wasn't anyone else anywhere nearby. I paused for a few seconds, but seeing nothing, I went on. Still sweating, I got on the road, and went on to the next intersection. Usually, I'd have checked to see if anyone was coming, and then made a quick U-turn and gone on. As I pulled into the turn lane for a U-turn, I hit the brakes instead. As soon as I did, 2 cars, a Mustang and an Eclipse, came over the blind hill racing. I think if I had been going at my normal speed, I'd have been hit by one or the other. Or both. I waited for almost a minute at that intersection, and then slowly drove back home. Back in kindergarten, my teacher was showing us cards with images on them, and we were supposed to name whatever was in the image. She's cycling through basic kindergarten vocabulary like vest, fireman, etc. when she pulls out a new card with a big black box. I'm thinking, hey, I know this, and raise my hand and say VCR. Wrong. Another kid raises his hand and says DVD player. This was a few years before the first DVD player was even released in the US. The memory just dropped out right here, but I'd still think back on it every few months. I've had a couple other experiences with things being completely out of place in time, like people wearing band shirts about 2 years before they exist, among other things, but this was the most vivid and freaky. Also, my grandmother had a bunch of creepy escapades she and my uncles experienced. For example, around Halloween every year in her town, huge, orange orbs would float around throughout the town. I know supposedly crazy lights can appear above ponds, but the nearest body of water is a river about 7 miles away. Everyone over the age of 50 in that town seems to recall it and don't consider it anything strange, but the lights stopped appearing about 40 years ago. And no, they weren't insects or anything, because according to them the orbs would vanish if you attempted to touch them. There was also some barn a bit down the road, and sometimes a child's bicycle would back out of the barn, turn, and start driving down the road in front of her house. It's a flat, moderately curvy road, so it's not like it could just roll out of the barn and down a hill. This happened to a friend. One summer afternoon, this guy went on a camping trip to a mountain with some of his school friends. They took almost abandoned road where, much to their surprise, they found a small house, hidden between some hills, in the middle of goddamn nowhere. Filled with curiosity, they decided to check it out. It was the moment of the day when the afternoon starts turning into night, and it was evident that someone had the lights on inside the house. They knocked the door. Nothing. Knocked again. Nothing. Some of them decided to peep through a window. They saw a TV on a dead channel, white noise coming through the speakers. In front of the TV a bed, and an apparently sick man in it. Not moving at all. They left immediately, of course. Some of them, including my friend, couldn't spend the night at the mountain so had to return. It was in the middle of the night, pitch dark, and they took a look at the house, again. They looked through the window and nothing changed, the same man, the same TV on the same dead channel. A sick, dying, maybe, man watching a dead channel alone in a house in the middle of nowhere. Alright, here's my spooky story. 3 of my friends and I were utterly bored during a summer night and figured we'd go for a mini road trip. We weren't really aiming to go anywhere, but rather just hopped onto the highway and proceeded to follow it to wherever. We did this when gas was still a reasonable price. So it's about 2 in the morning, we had been driving since about 10 p.m. and we had gotten off the highway and wandered into some little town in the middle of Pennsylvania. The road we were on kept becoming narrower, until it eventually became a single-lane road just passing through the town. We eventually passed by a small cemetery, and as I look out my window I see a family standing at the entrance of the cemetery dressed in Sunday church clothes just staring across the street with a blank expression. We were doing about 30 miles per hour and I was able to tell that it was a tall man, probably the father standing next to his wife with 2 teenage-looking kids next to them, and the daughter holding a stroller. The stroller looked very vintage, like one of those you see from the 50s or 60s. They didn't move, or do anything, they just stood there in a line in front of the cemetery and stared across the street, which had nothing more than tall grass. Needless to say, I freaked out and screamed like a girl when I saw this, and that's when everyone else in the car turned and saw this too, at which point they all screamed like girls and we punched it out of that freaky town. To this night I still can't rationalize what I saw that night. I used to be a nervous sleeper, listening for sounds, making sure my curtains were closed to prevent something looking in at me and so on. I was probably about 15, and my parents had gone away for the weekend, so I was alone in the house. Around 3 a.m., I wake up. Why am I awake? I have no idea. Did I hear something? No? How odd. So, I'm lying there, listening to the house and slowly falling back asleep, when my bedroom door, which I knew I had shut, clicks audibly as the latch disengages, and swings about a quarter way open. I turn into a pile of goosebumps, and lay there still for quite a while, straining my ears and eyes against the dark and silence. Finally I switch on the light. This is worse, because all I can see in the hallway is darkness, and now I am visible to whatever lurks outside. It took me ages, laying there, covered in goosebumps, to gain the courage to get up and check what was going on. Turns out it was the wind, blowing my not quite properly shut door open. The house is on a hill, and shifts a little from time to time, making some doors stop latching shut properly. Mundane really, but the most goosebump-inducingly creeped out I have ever been in my life. Looking into that perfectly black hallway through a narrow crack of the door, if some pale hand had come through the door, or some eyes had glinted back, or a darker form had shifted in that darkness, I would have been terrified, but not entirely surprised.